Hi class, it's me again, Susan Priest, and this week we'll be working on utilitarianism, which is a pretty robust moral ethical theory. So there's quite a lot to it. So again, like the last week when we were doing the categorical imperative, the idea this week is really to fully explore the range of utilitarianism by, specifically reading John Stuart Mill, and then you're reading another article by Louis Pojman, where he identifies some of the challenges to utilitarianism. But I'm also going to give you a little bit of an overview of Jeremy Bentham and the history of utilitarianism, and some philosophers that you've already read or I've already talked to you about. For example, Peter Singer, who is an example of a modern utilitarianism, a modern utilitarian, excuse me. So we can see that utilitarianism is an idea that gets promoted, first of all, in the 18th century. So that's important because it has to be, it's a product of the Enlightenment. It's a product of the idea that morality doesn't have to be a divine command ethics. So when we were talking earlier about the progression of moral theories and moral ideas, see that utilitarianism is really kind of in a way, the newest school of thought on moral and ethical theory. So David Hume, who's a Scottish philosopher, who wrote about how emotion and sentiment can be a source for moral philosophy. And he is sometimes said to have proposed utilitarianism, but it's really Jeremy Bentham who is the first philosopher who gave utilitarianism form. And Jeremy Bentham asserted that morality is not about pleasing God. Morality is not about being faithful to abstract rules, but in fact that morality is about being as happy as possible. And he proposed that the principle of utility helps people to see that the principle that approves or disapproves of an act based on the happiness it produces is what should be used to look at the consequence or the happiness effect of any given act. John Stuart Mill was Jeremy Bentham's student, and you'll be reading excerpts from his classic work on utilitarianism this week. Probably a little bit more thoughtful and developed than Jeremy Bentham in some ways. Both Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are referred to as classic utilitarians. So scholars often acknowledge that the classic utilitarian thought comprises three ideas. The first being actions are to be judged rightly or wrongly solely based on their virtue of their consequences. Nothing else matters. This is why utilitarianism is often also referred to as a consequentialist ethical theory, meaning in direct opposition to Kantian deontological ethics, the actions, you're always looking at what's the impact of this act, more than just the act itself. The second idea is that utilitarians assess the consequences of an act by evaluating the amount of happiness or unhappiness that is created, and that nothing else matters. And then a third idea, which is really asserted by Mill, is that everyone's happiness counts the same. So my happiness is not more important than your happiness. your happiness is not more important than your cousin's happiness. Also, by extension, your happiness is not more important than the happiness of the person that you don't know in, say, Rwanda or Rohingya. So John Stuart Mill is considered both an act and a rule utilitarian. So some of these things he explores in the essay that you're reading for this week, but just a couple of points. John Stuart Mill differed from Jeremy Bentham in that Mill argued that some pleasures are better than others. So he wasn't a hedonist saying, just do whatever feels good. That is not what utilitarianism is about. Really, it's that John Stuart Mill acknowledged that intellectual pleasures, thought experience, what is justice, are more important than physical pleasures. So to be denied the ability to have intellectual pleasures might even be more important than physical pleasures. So an act utilitarian. So act utilitarians look at individual acts. So whatever that may be. So I'm choosing to think about what groceries you buy, right? You choose to buy certain groceries. So when you're buying those groceries, do you think about the happiness that is generated for the most number of people when you're buying those groceries? Do you say, oh, wow, if I buy this product, some people will be deprived of some other substance. We'll get to this because you can see how some modern utilitarians are in fact vegetarians. But the act utilitarian says that what is right is that the act itself, you look at the act itself and the effect it has on general happiness. Now, okay, this is a little more subtle. So rule utilitarians, a little bit more Kantian in a sense, say that the rightness of an act is determined by the impact on general happiness of the rule the action exemplifies. So, an act utilitarian might say, well, it would be okay to kill a group of people who have a contagious disease. Let's say there's a whole town that's infected with the bubonic plague. It would be okay to kill everyone in the town because that would create the greatest happiness for the most people, because more people would be saved if that town was eliminated. But a rule utilitarian would look at that a little bit differently, and they would say, well, we can't really say that it's moral to kill a whole town of people to save the rest of humanity, because in essence, murdering a whole town of people does not actually provide happiness or general well-being to the most number of people. So as you're reading through John Stuart Mill, really look at how he is formulating. And you kind of have to wade through it a little bit, but notice that he is in his writing, he's talking to his critics at the same time that he is proposing what utilitarianism is. So make sure that you can distinguish between his assertions and his arguments in defense of himself to his critics, because I think that might be helpful in the reading. Okay, so a second article that you have to read this week is a short article by Louis Pojman on the challenges to utilitarianism. And he says there are many objections, but he's going to talk about these 5. So what I want you to consider is that every objection or challenge to utilitarianism raises some questions. So now utilitarianism says every person is equally entitled to happiness. So think about it this way. Utilitarianism suggests that you really have to be thinking about happiness for the most number of people. And these are not necessarily people you know. That doesn't matter. So one of the challenges is that if really you're supposed to be thinking about the ways that you could help people, there are an infinite number of ways that you could be doing a better job of increasing happiness on the planet, and so you would never get any rest. That's one objection. So the second objection he calls the absurd implications objection. And he says that he's saying in some ways the idea of utilitarianism is counterintuitive because it might lead one to believe a lie is as good as the truth. Because remember, if you're really looking at utilitarianism and you're saying, well, it would be okay if I lied to you because if it created more happiness, right? So in that sense, a utilitarian could see that a lie is as good as the truth. And how could that be ethical? The third is the integrity objection. And again, this leads back to the idea that utilitarianism might lead to personal alienation. And go back to that initial assertion by John Stuart Mill that everybody's happiness is equal. So if your happiness or the happiness of someone that I've never met before is as important as my happiness, then I might become actually a little alienated from myself. That's kind of interesting. So there's a big objection, which is called the justice objection. And that is, and you can see this is generally promoted by people who are not utilitarians, saying, well, you could say that it promotes, let's say you have a town, there's been going through a lot of racial conflict and strife, and everything has been just been chaos, and then you have, let's say, a sheriff in town who's finally calming things down, and people are coming together, and then there's some kind of racially motivated incident out of the blue again. And so the sheriff could decide, I'm going to cover up this act for the good of the many, because, this gets back to the idea that you could cover something up to promote the happiness of the many. And that this would mean that you're promoting an unjust act for the good of the many. Now, this is kind of funny, and I won't spend very much time on it, but Pojman says that it's generally true that people think that if you have a set of morals, then everybody should know what those morals are in order to follow them. And this is actually not true of utilitarians. So how does that actually work? So I'm going to refer to another article, and it's not one that you're reading, but I think it kind of has a more simplified understanding of sort of the problems with utilitarianism. So James Rachels and his son Stuart Rachels wrote this article about utilitarianism. And so the idea about utilitarianism, which you can see, I've already kind of talked about, or the Pojman talks about, but three big critiques is this idea that utilitarianism might promote lying to achieve the best consequences. And also that, so remember the no rest thing, utilitarianism is too demanding. Like it says, you have to do this, and you have to do this, and then you have to be thinking about is that creating the most happiness? And that might actually also disrupt our personal relationships, because really now I'm supposed to see that some unknown person out there is as important as, say, my family, right? So this leads to a kind of skewed understanding from our normal conception of reality. So, and the thing is, they acknowledge that actually most utilitarians aren't going to promote lying, that lying doesn't promote good consequences in the real world. And the principle of utility is really a guide for choosing rules, not individual acts. So, of course, this is going back to the difference between act utilitarian and rule utilitarian. And then there's some other people who say, well, maybe common sense is wrong. Common sense says, my family is more important than the stranger. Well, maybe that's not true. So, as you're looking at utilitarianism, you can see there's a lot out there. Notice that in some of the supplementary videos, we have someone talking about how Jeremy Bentham in his time was actually kind of a social reformer and very progressive, talking about, gay rights and other things in the 18th century. Can you believe that? So utilitarian philosophers are often seen as social reformers. So for example, here's an example of a utilitarian philosopher or someone who is saying, I don't actually know if this person pictured as a utilitarian philosopher, so let me not misspeak, but this idea that somebody is saying euthanasia should be respected because that means that you have the right to live and die with dignity. So you shouldn't restrict people's rights to control their own lives. Of course, if you're promoting killing of everyone, that might be something else. But notice Peter Singer, who I brought up before in a previous lecture. So you might want to, he has one article in here, but you might explore some of his other articles because he is a modern utilitarian from Australia. And he argues things like people should give money to alleviate famine and poverty. And if you have the means to give money, you should, right? He also calls for animal liberation. So really looking at how research uses animals for their own means. He advocates for vegetarianism. He calls himself a flexible vegan. And he is opposed to the death penalty, among other things. So you can kind of go and look at the writings of Peter Singer as an example of a modern utilitarian to sort of explore his thoughts on that. So that when you're writing your essay, you might want to choose that. Or you could choose some other article and posit a utilitarian view, like John Stuart Mill's. So really look at some of the things that are implied by utilitarian philosophy. So intellectual pleasure. So I have this self-portrait called The Map of Days, a little piece of that, because it's kind of for me, artwork is a way that I can explore topics in a sort of non-literal way, but also to look at what constitutes our life, our education, the our choices, our thoughts. So for me, observing artwork and is one way that I look at and contemplate the world. So happiness is the key, and how you live your life should be maximizing happiness for the most people. So don't forget that the implications of utilitarianism cannot be conceived as being selfish, egoistic, or hedonistic, because the call is an implication to contribute to the many. So I have a picture that I used before, I believe, of some refugees from the crisis in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, of exterminating and displacing Rohingya Muslims from the Burmese Buddhist community. So think about how the ideas of utilitarianism have implications for how you think about many things, so that you can really play around with exploring those ideas in your essay this week. I look forward to reading them.